Professor Gabriel Reynolds. He's a top scholar, and right now he's a professor at Notre Dame, professor of theology. His recent book is called Allah, God in the Quran, published by the Yale University Press. He did his doctoral work at the Yale University itself in Islamic studies. Currently, he researches the Quran and Muslim-Christian relations, and is professor of Islamic studies and theology in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. He's the author of the Quran and its biblical subtext, Rootless 2010, and The Emergence of Islam, Fortress 2012. The translator of Abdul Jabbar's critique of Christian origins, that was BYU 2008. And he's also the editor of the Quran and its historical context, which is the subject of today's talk. This was the title of his book that was published in 2011 by Routledge. And that's a wonderful book. I will recommend it to the audience here. I have read it and I have it with me, and I think it's a wonderful read, and a lot of research and an excellent work has gone into it. Professor Reynolds directed, along with Mehdi Aziz, the Quran Seminar, a year-long collaborative project dedicated to encouraging dialogue among scholars of the Quran, the acts of which appeared as the Quran Seminar commentary in De Gruyter 2016. In 2018, he published the Quran and the Bible with Yale University Press, and in 2020, Allah, the God in the Quran, also with the Yale University Press. At Notre Dame, he teaches courses on theology, Muslim-Christian relations, and Islamic origins. He's also a regular contributor to Notre Dame's World Religions, World Church podcast. Insofar as this talk is concerned, Reynolds' main argument is, Quran should be appreciated in the light of its conversation with earlier scriptures. The Quran does mention the Bible, the Torah, the Injil, the Zabur, and the earlier scriptures, of other people. So, Quran, Gabriel's thesis is that we need to understand the Quran through these sources, through these conversations the Quran has with, has with these scriptures, rather than through questionable sources, questionable ahadith, questionable tafasir, and also what you call the sirah. He challenges the idea that not all sirah is authentic, because we know a lot of historical, questionable historical things have come into the sirah too. People have tried to kind of make it an hagiographical text. So therefore, his main thesis is the Quran must be understood. And in fact, he says the Quran demands it, unlike the critical scholarship and also the Muslim tradition, which has tried to keep these two separate. By actually biblical literature, Gabriel includes not just the Old Testament and the New Testament. He also, interestingly, includes the Apocrypha. But I don't know about pseudepigrapha also, Gabriel. I don't know if you also include that, pseudepigrapha and other other biblical scriptures which are not part of the Bible itself. So nevertheless, so this is going to be a time where you can ask your questions and explore these ideas as we go along. And this is going to be an interesting lecture, I'm sure. People who have been waiting for it don't need to wait any longer. I hand over the mic to Gabriel now. Over to you, Gabriel. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Faiz. That's a very generous introduction. The only problem is it sets the expectations high.
No.
So I'd like to bring those expectations down. It's really what I'd like to present is a very simple reflection on, yes, the Quran and the Bible, but also some insights, a lot of which are due to the recent work of Ahmed al-Jalad, a scholar at Ohio State University in the United States. So some insights precisely about the historical context of the development of the Arabic language and what we can know about pre-Islamic Arabic religion or Arabian religion from the inscriptions that we have. So those would be the two basic elements, exactly as Faiz said. My argument is that the Quran itself points us to its historical context. And so what's at stake is not whether the Quran is the word of God or not, but it's just a question of method of reading the text. And so I suggest that a lot can be gained in appreciation of the text by attentiveness to its historical context meaning 6th, 7th century Arabia. And we'll see how it goes with the talk. So I'm going to go ahead now and share the screen. I'll speak for about 45 minutes. Is that okay, Faiz? That's what we
Yes,
spoke.
yes. Take your time, Gabriel.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and especially to the Islamic Forum for Moderate Thought for having invited me, for the trust you've shown in me. Um, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. I hope the screen is coming through okay, Faith. You
Yes,
can see.
it's perfect.
Great, wonderful. Okay, so off we go. As I mentioned, the basic focus of the talk will be on the Bible and the Quran, and I'd like to do that in several steps. First, a basic introduction to what is biblical literature. That might be too simple for some of you who will know this very well, but just in case, I felt some background might be useful. And then very briefly, I'll refer to earlier scholarship on the Quran and the Bible. I think it's important to do that because there is a long history of looking at biblical tradition, especially in Western scholarship, but not only. Nevertheless, most of the insights that I have on the case studies I'll present are things that have been discovered earlier and worked on by earlier scholars. So, what I present is something like a summation or a synopsis with some commentary, and not really like revolutionary new insights that I've discovered. Right? Sometimes we have the tendency to ignore earlier scholarship, and I'd like to avoid that. And the two case studies I'd like to present, excuse me, are on first Pharaoh and Moses in the Quran and the Bible, and then Ashab al-Kahf, or the companions of the cave. So let's go ahead and start with biblical literature. The Christian Bible is made up of 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. There is some difference over the content of the Old Testament between Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox, but the 27 books are accepted as canon by all major Christian traditions. And there you can see how they're divided in the Christian tradition. Of course, we should keep in mind that the Old Testament in Jewish tradition is the Bible. Jews refer to the Bible as the Tanakh, referring to the three principal divisions of the Torah, the prophets, Nevi'im in Hebrew, and the writings, or Ketuvim in Hebrew. The order of the books in the Hebrew Bible is different than in the Christian Old Testament. The word Bible comes from Greek biblos, meaning book. As I mentioned, Jews refer to the Bible, which the Old Testament is almost entirely in Hebrew, with a few Aramaic passages, principally in the book of Daniel. They refer to it as the Tanakh. The New Testament, as most of you will know, is in Greek, although Jesus spoke in Aramaic. That's interesting because it probably shows that the earliest compilers of the Gospels did not conceive of Jesus as someone who received a scripture from heaven, in which case most likely they would have sought to preserve his words in Aramaic, but simply they sought to give an anecdote or a record. Mr. Belsi, if I just ask a favor that not to annotate because it's visible to everyone. Thank you so much. You see those arrows are visible, right? So in fact, what the earliest compilers of the New Testament meant to do was to transmit an account of the life of Jesus, not simply a historical account, but rather one which communicates what they saw as the gospel or the good news of salvation that is found through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. The Gospels were composed in the second half of the first century AD or CE, and there you have standard dates. Some people disagree by 10 years or so, but Mark is generally assumed to be the earliest. It's important to, I'm going to stop the share and restart it, and I think that might do away with the arrows. Let's see how this goes. Okay, here we go. So it's important to keep in mind, exactly as Faye said, that when we're interested in the late antique setting of Islam's origins, so when we're thinking about the 6th or 7th century, Christians and Jews were not transmitting simply the canonical Bible, the books of the Old and New Testament, but rather all sorts of traditions, a little bit analogous to the way that in classical Islamic civilization, not only the Quran and the Hadith, but all sorts of akhbar were transmitted. So with biblical tradition and late antiquity, among Jewish writings, not only the Bible, but also a text known as the Mishnah, traditionally understood to communicate the oral law, compiled around the first 2 centuries CE or AD, and the Talmud, which is in principle a commentary on the Mishnah, but in fact is much more extensive than that. We have 2 principal collections of the Talmud, one the Babylonian and one a bit earlier, the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud, both written principally in Aramaic, the being principally in Hebrew. And then we have various midrashim, which are commentaries on biblical books. A lot of attention has been paid to the Bereshit Rabbah or Genesis Rabbah, the great commentary on Genesis, which was composed in 300 to 500 CE, but other midrashim are post-Islamic, written in the Middle Ages. And then finally, I would point out targums, which are glosses on the Hebrew Bible, principally from Hebrew into Aramaic. These are of interest for Quranic studies now and then. Note, for example, the Targum Onkelos, which was written in the 2nd century CE. Some, like the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan, are possibly written, at least in their final form, after the Quran. And some Quranic scholarship has been based on things like the Pseudo-Jonathan Targum, when probably it is too late to be of interest in the Quran. As for Christian writings, I know this is, I don't know if the next part of the talk will be more exciting, but this is a very basic sort of background. So just bear with me here. Sorry if it's boring. For Christian writings, exactly as Faiz said, we have Apocryphal Gospels. Now, the term gospel for these apocryphal writings isn't really accurate, because gospel, as the way it's used in the New Testament, refers to the account of the saving life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And most of these other works that are sometimes called gospels are collections of sayings or anecdotes from Jesus's childhood, miracle accounts, and don't really fit the form of gospel as they are in the New Testament. But among these are the Proto-Evangelium of James, which gives the events leading up to the ministry of Jesus, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and Pseudo-Matthew. There's some question about whether Pseudo-Matthew is early enough to be of interest for Quranic studies. That's the text, for example, where we have the story of the palm tree, as we know from Surat Maryam in the Quran. In the Pseudo-Matthew, it takes place in the course of the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt, not in the Nativity, but that's another topic in another lecture. And then finally, there's a whole huge library of literature known as patristic material in Greek and Latin, also other languages, including Ethiopic. But I would point out here Syriac, just because of its proximity geographically to Islam's origins, and among the great Syriac fathers who wrote extensively commentaries on the Bible and homilies and poetic works are Afrahat, Ephraim, Narsai, and Jacob of Surur. Okay, so that's a basic background. And then on to step 2, which is a look at earlier scholarship on the Bible. Just to let you know, the most important works probably on the relationship between the Quran and the Bible. The foundational one is What Did Muhammad Take from Judaism, translated simply as Judaism and Islam, written by the man you see on the right, Abraham Geiger, in 1833. And then a whole host of works in the first half of the 20th century, many by Jewish scholars like Geiger, including Joseph Horowitz and Heinrich Speyer, but also by Christian scholars like Tor André from Sweden, originally wrote this work in German, but was translated into French on the origins of Islamic Christianity. And then what I tried to do in the 2018 work, Quran and the Bible, was basically to bring all this scholarship together in one volume. It doesn't really do that much, but hopefully it's interesting anyway. Okay, just to make some basic observations about signs from the Quran that reading biblical scholarship is interesting and important. I just thought I would point out some biblical vocabulary in the Quran. I don't really want to enter into the debate over whether this vocabulary is foreign vocabulary. Others have made the point that it could have been taken from languages such as Greek and Arabized before the Quran was proclaimed, and so could be considered Arabic. It's probably impossible to resolve that debate, if that even makes sense, right? The question is, did the prophet or someone in the prophet's context borrow the vocabulary from non-Arabic languages, or was it already integrated into Arabic and part of the Arabic tongue? So I'm just going to set that aside. But among the interesting bits of vocabulary, Iblis, which is related to the Greek word diabolos, maybe or maybe not, passing through Syriac. Shaitan, also, I know I'm starting with the negative and dark side here. Shaitan, coming from Hebrew Satan, but probably passing through Syriac. Torah, many will know, is related to Hebrew Torah. Some may not know that Injil is related to the Greek word for gospel, which is euangelion. You can see the nun, jim, and lam in the Arabic are actually all found because the doubling of the gamma there produces the N sound. That's why we say euangelion in that Greek word. Nasara, as you know, comes from a Greek term that appears in the Acts of the Apostles for the Christians. Ma'idah is an interesting one. We won't speak about this much today. Just to introduce another language from Ethiopic. Ahbar for rabbis or Jewish religious leaders from Hebrew. Asatir, and the phrase Asatir al-Awwalin probably comes from Greek historia, where we get the English word history. And one final one, Sijil, which is means something like scrolls in the Quran. We have a passage where the heavens are said to be wrapped up like scrolls. Probably comes from Latin sigillum, maybe from Greek instead. I wanted just to introduce why it's interesting to think about the relationship of non-Arabic vocabulary, just to make the point that for centuries already before Islam, Aramaic was a regular part of the historical context. In the Nabatean region, the language was something like a mix of Aramaic and Arabic. Probably the native language of the Nabateans was Arabic with much Aramaic vocabulary. And this is just one of the bits I'm borrowing from Ahmed al-Jalad, as I mentioned before. This is an inscription that comes from the 3rd century. And if you look closely, you have all of the Aramaic words there in, for example, in line 2, you see Bert, which is something, the Aramaic word for daughter instead of bint, as it would be in Arabic rather. And you have almost a 50-50 mix between Aramaic and Arabic. So when we're thinking about 6th, 7th century Arabia, we're thinking of a context which was not linguistically purely Arabic, but included languages such as Aramaic and Hebrew and Greek, probably Ethiopic as well. There was an interesting dynamic linguistic situation at the time and place of Qur'an's origins. Okay, I'd like to introduce something else which lets us know a bit more about the monotheistic context in the century before Islam, just as a way of saying that not only was linguistically their dynamic situation, but there's good reason to think that monotheism was widespread in the context of the origins of Islam. Some of you might have heard of this inscription, which was published about recently in an Arabic publication, Naqsh al-Taboob. This was found in Yemen and is in the latest form of the South Arabian script and in the South Arabian language. And but the interesting point is that it communicates something very close to the Basmala. in the Quran. And so Ahmad al-Jalad has written on this, calling this the pre-Islamic basmala. And you have the invocation there in the top right. The interesting point is it brings together both Allah and Rahmanan, probably, which is the South Arabian form of Ar-Rahman. Um, and maybe Rahim, Ahmad al-Jalad doesn't think that the second occurrence of Rahamim refers to Ar-Rahim, but rather is an imperative. Um, I'll just make 2 points about this and then I'll move on to the actual heart of the lecture. One is that it seems to have elements from the Psalms, and you can see that down below. I've just cut and paste 2 passages of Professor Jalad's article. Line invocation 2 seems to be connected to Psalm 90, verse 14. And then intriguingly, invocation 3 seems to be connected to the same psalm, just a few verses earlier. Jalad argues in this article that the combination of El-Ilah or Allah and Rahman may reflect a context in which Abraha's expansion into North Arabia brought the North Arabian word for God as Allah, together with the South Arabian word for God, which was Rahmanan or Rahman. And this was a way of expressing a sort of solidarity between North and South, possibly in opposition to Christians who would have had, and we know this from other South Arabian inscriptions, a Trinitarian invocation. We could speak more about this if you're interested, although I would suggest also you bring Professor Jalad himself to this context in the future because he is the expert. Okay, very briefly before I get to Moses, just to share with you some common biblical themes in the Quran. There are many, many themes, but signs and eschatology, just a couple of particular references. The Quran refers to a trumpet blast on the last day. It refers to a beast or Dabba min al-Ard. Also on the last day, these are things known from the New Testament, trumpet from Paul's writings and the beast from the book of Revelation. The Quran speaks of tahrif in the verbal form, yuharifuna, and this is an important argument that Christians use against Jews historically. The Quran speaks of the killing of the prophets, qatal anbiya bighayri haqq, and that's an important theme in Christian accusations against the Jews. And then the Quran uses many biblical turns of phrase, the eye of the needle, known from the Synoptic Gospels, the phrase uncircumcised hearts, qulubuna ghulf, is widespread in the biblical text, and then the use in 2 places of mustard seed to refer to something very small. The interesting point about these biblical turns of phrase, however, is that they tend to be Christian and not Jewish. This is the case with most of these here. They tend to be used for a new theological point, so the Quran is not just imitating something in the Bible, but reapplying or shaping biblical ideas, which shows us that the Quran is in a dynamic and creative relationship with the Bible. And this is a really important thing to point out about Western scholarship about Quran and Bible. If you start reading not only my works, but those of many, many others who are working on this, Guillaume D., Nikolai Sinai, Sherry Lowen, Holger Zellington, Imran al-Bedawi, all of the scholars who are working on this, you just read almost ad nauseum. Everyone agrees on this point today that the Quran is not simply borrowing or copying, but has its own theological agenda, is reusing, reshaping, and reapplying biblical themes to advance that agenda. Okay, in order to sort of make that point, I'd like to pursue 2 case studies here. The first is on Pharaoh and Moses. And in particular, I'd just like to comment on something in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, Surah 26. One line here, this is the translation of Arthur Droge, in which Pharaoh, first we have a scene probably in Midian, in which God speaks to Moses and sends him to Pharaoh. And then at some point, Pharaoh says to Moses in verse 18, Alam nurabbika فينا وليدا وَلَبِثْتَ فِينَا مِنْ عُمُرِكَ سِنِينَ. Did we not bring you up among us as a child, and did you not remain among us for some years of your life? Okay, so there's a very intriguing suggestion in this line that Pharaoh himself raised Moses, and that's interesting, and I'll explain why that's interesting in a moment. Now, it could be that Moses simply lived somehow in the palace of Pharaoh, but was not, in fact, Pharaoh's adopted son. But when we look at Surah Al-Qasas, we see a scene in which Pharaoh's wife seems to adopt Moses, or at least suggest the adoption of Moses. And so in verse 9 there at the bottom, وَقَالَتْ إِمْرَأَةُ فِرْعَوْنَ, etc. Do not kill him. It may be that he will benefit us, or we may adopt him as a son. نَتَّخِذَهُ وَلَدًا. So now, it doesn't say that she actually did, but I would say the evidence is pretty strong when you put together Surah Al-Shu'ara and Surah Al-Qasas, that the Qur'an is implying that Moses is Pharaoh's adopted son. Okay? All right. The reason why this is interesting is because it marks a clear contrast with the biblical text. And so we read in Exodus 2 that it was Pharaoh's daughter who adopted, Pharaoh's daughter who adopted Moses, and not Pharaoh's wife. And so Pharaoh would be not the adoptive father of Moses, but the adoptive grandfather. And one more point about this whole context, another contrast that we find between Quran and Bible on this count is that in the book of Exodus, the Pharaoh of Moses' childhood is not the Pharaoh of his adulthood. They're two different pharaohs. In the Quran, we have the sense that there is only one Pharaoh. Pharaoh is one character. And the Pharaoh who chased Moses out of Egypt, seeking to kill him, is the same Pharaoh who rejected Moses' invitation to submit to God and let the Israelites free in his adulthood. Right? So in the Quran, there's one, but in Exodus, there's two. In Exodus 2, we read that one Pharaoh sought to kill Moses in his childhood. And then in Exodus 4, we read, go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead, implying that Pharaoh of Moses' adulthood is a different Pharaoh, a different ruler of Egypt. Okay, and so the point I would like to make is that by making Pharaoh the adoptive father of Moses, and by having that same Pharaoh still around when Moses is an adult, that this scene in Surah 26 then becomes a confrontation between father and son. The father appeals to Moses' sense of filial obligation, his obligation as a son, by saying, did we not raise you up among us as a child? And did you not remain among us for some years of your life? I don't have the full passage, but if you look at verses 20, 21, you'll see that Moses responds in this passage by denying that Pharaoh has done any favor to the Israelites, and by inviting him to submit to God. And so, in a sense, what happens is Moses places his faith in God above his obligation to his unbelieving father. This is interesting because it fits very nicely with an important theological theme in the Quran, which is faith over family. And I won't read through all these passages. There are actually many more. These are just some examples from Surah Al-Baqarah, Al-Ma'idah, and Araf, which show that the tendency of unbelievers is to follow their fathers, their unbelieving fathers, and refuse the invitation to monotheism and submission to God. And by manifesting Moses as someone who rejects his unbelieving adoptive father and instead is obedient to God, we have a clear contrast between unbelievers placing family over faith, and a believer, not only a believer, but a prophet, putting faith over family. Okay, so that's my basic argument about Moses and Pharaoh, and I think I'll move on to Companions of the Cave. I'm a little over halfway through, so I'll be done in about 15, 20 minutes perhaps, and then we can have a discussion. I look forward to your thoughts, criticisms, questions, any of that. So first, allow me to introduce just a really interesting work of art. So this is not announced, but I wanted to share this with you because I find it very intriguing and I'd like to use it with my students. This is by the American artist, Sandow Burke. It's from his work called The American Qur'an. And what he has done is he has written out by hand an English translation of the Qur'an. And he has, for every opening page of each surah, instead of giving a traditional illumination or illustration, he has set the title of the surah in the context of American life. So presenting an American Quran. This one is particularly nice from Surah Al-Kahf, or the cave, instead of presenting a traditional scene from wherever in the Middle East one would locate this event, and it might be Ephesus. He has given a scene of miners in the United States. This would traditionally be associated with Appalachia, maybe the state of West Virginia, whose mine has collapsed. And there they are sleeping in the cave, sleeping, of course, with a dog. So, and the other illustrations are also all intriguing and make an interesting point about Islam having a place in America. Okay, and anyway, let's get to the heart of the matter, which is about the seven sleepers and Surah Al-Kahf, but particularly the account of Ashab al-Kahf. I just want to step back and introduce you to a work known as the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus. As I mentioned at the beginning, when we think of Quran and Bible, we sort of mean Bible in quotation marks, because the literature of Jews and Christians of interest to the Quran far surpasses the canonical Bible. In this case, we have a work that was originally written in Greek, excuse me, about 7 young Christian boys, sometimes said to be 8, in a different version, who live in the city of Ephesus. This work was originally written in Greek, as I mentioned, in the 5th century, but in the later that century, or maybe in the 6th century, was translated into Syriac. This is a passage from Sidney Griffith. I'm going to be quoting some passages from a reflection on this story by one of the Syriac fathers we've mentioned, namely Jacob of Saruk, who wrote a work called The Memra on the Sleepers of Ephesus. Memra is something like a homily or a sermon, like a khutbah that could be given in the context of religious services. I won't read through this long passage, but I did want to give you the historical context for the Christian story. It's a really intriguing historical context that relates to the Christianization of the Roman Empire. The story proceeds in a time of persecution when the Christ-hating pagan emperor Decius was going to compel Christians in the city of Ephesus to make sacrifices to the pagan gods, and some young faithful boys fled from the city, and God cast a miraculous sleep upon them. And later there was an inscription and a lead tablet that put the story of them next to the place where they fell asleep. And then about 200 years later, they were awakened rather, in the time of the Christ-loving Emperor Theodosius II. And in fact, their awakening helped Theodosius II to be convinced of the resurrection of the body. Okay, so that's the basic story in the Christian version, and you could see how the sleep works. They fell asleep in the time of paganism, and they were awakened in the time of the Christian Byzantine Empire. Okay, and I'm just going to point out some elements which show that the Quran is closely in conversation with this tradition, although it is making it its own. To begin with, the difficult word in verse 9, araqim, probably refers to an inscription. The word in Arabic can be associated with writing. And in fact, we find in the account, as mentioned already, that tablets of lead were placed next to the cave. And so it makes good sense that that would be mentioned in the Quran. Okay, a little more difficult to unravel and explain is the presence of the dog. This is interesting, the kelb, which appears with the sleepers or the ashab al-kahf. And this has caused some problems to interpreters because the dog is, in certain ways, a dog can be seen as ritually unclean. So why was he inside the house? There's some hadith about not having dogs inside a house. Why was he inside the cave, rather? But we could see how it fits into the story, because in the Christian tradition, the metaphor that Jacob uses for the sleepers is one of a shepherd and his sheep. So the sleepers are compared to sheep, and the devil is compared to a wolf, or maybe the emperor, the pagan emperor, is compared to a wolf. And in the context of the homily of Jacob of Sarug, it said that God left a watcher to be guarding their limbs. Now, just want to make an interesting point. The word watcher would usually invoke an angel. This is one of the ways in biblical tradition of referring to an angel as a watcher. And it's possible and probably likely that Jacob was thinking of an angel being placed there to defend their bodies. There's also a sense of God preserving or taking care of the bodies of Ashab al-Kahf, because it's God who turns them over, presumably not to be consumed by the earth or to decompose. What I've read from Sidney Griffith tells me that in most early traditions on dogs, as far as we know from the Arabic-speaking world, dogs are celebrated principally as hunting dogs, but not as guard dogs. But in the Syriac tradition, dogs are remembered principally for their roles in the life of a shepherd, where a dog is the one who preserves the sheep. So, I mean, presumably, possibly, we have a scenario according to which a Syriac metaphor, where which is lived out in that particular context, where an angel protecting sheep becomes a dog protecting sheep, was adopted into an Arabian context. In any case, we do know that in the Syriac context, in the Christian context, the watcher became a dog, because we have an early account of a Byzantine traveler who speaks of the city of Ephesus as the place of the sleeping brothers with the dog at their feet. The dog even gets a name, Viri Kanos. So we know what his name was. Okay, just a couple more points here. Two more, I think, and then we'll be done. But sometimes I don't remember my own PowerPoints. One is the money. This is very intriguing as well, which relates to, which helps us see how a Syriac Christian text can help clarify meanings in the Quran. There's a problem in the Quran because there's a reference, not really a problem, it's just a question. There's a reference to money in the city, and that's in verse 19. And there's some problem of whether and how that relates to the story. Why was it included in the Quran? And we see that in the Syriac text, the money is very important. In the Syriac text, the money is a coin. And so we can see here, we can see here a small change that he had in his purse. And when they passed the change around in the city of Ephesus, they discovered that it was extraordinary, because he had brought a coin from the days of Decius, and it was now 200 years later. Presumably the coin had the image of the Emperor Decius and his name on it. And so the people think he had found treasure, a buried treasure. As for the treasure you have found, let us be sharers with you in it. So it's just a neat narrative detail. In the Christian account, they went to buy some money, and it was something which proved that they actually came from the time of Decius, 200 years earlier, and it was not, in fact, buried treasure. So it leads to a controversy, and eventually that's how, in the Christian story, the young men go to the bishop, and the bishop verifies the miracle. Now, in the Christian story, as in the Quran, the point of Surah Al-Kahf is the affirmation of the miracle. Wa'dullahi haqqun wa inna sa'ata la rayba fiha. The promise of God is true, and the hour there is no doubt about it. There's a reference to building a building above them in the Quran. It's a masjid, a place of prostration. Also, in the Christian tradition, they decide to build a shrine over the bodies. But the real point is that in the Christian tradition, the Emperor Theodosius is doubting the resurrection of the body. He's not doubting the afterlife, but he believes, along with certain people at the time associated with the Father Origen, at least he's considering the doctrine that bodies are not resurrected, but we have some sort of spiritual communion with God in the afterlife, and the return of the sleepers allows him to see that God can really bring dead bodies to life. We know the Quran is interested in this because we also have the account of the man and his donkey who fell asleep as well and was awakened in Surah Al-Baqarah, also in the Quran. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to some basic conclusions, and then we can turn to an open conversation if you would like. As I mentioned, what we can learn from this study is that it's not a question of, as Abraham Geiger put it, what did Muhammad take from Judaism? We could add Christianity to that. In both cases, the Quran is not only rhetorically or stylistically reshaping biblical or Jewish Christian material, but the Quran is reshaping it in a theological and substantive manner. So the case of Moses, the Quran is advancing its particular message of faith over family, unbelieving family, that is. And in the case of Ashab al-Kahf, the Quran is advancing its message about as-Sa'ah, and the Quran is not interested in the debates that were going on in the time of Theodosius, but it is interesting in affirming the resurrection of the body. It takes the story as one which could be brought together with the story of the man and his donkey to show that God can really bring dead bodies to life. Another point is that we should not think of the Quran, even if it's in conversation with traditions that we know from Syriac texts, as somehow a Syriac or even a mixed Syrio-Arabic document. The Quran is Arabic. It does have vocabulary that we know from other languages. Whether or not the vocabulary entered into Arabic for the sake of the Quran or was earlier integrated into Arabic is an open question. But in any case, when we look at the Ashab al-Kahf account, for example, we do not find Syriacisms. We do not find the presence of Syriac words. It is an Arabic account. And so we should be careful in thinking about the Quran's context to not lose sight of the Arabic nature of the Quran. So that would be going to an extreme. It is not justified based on what we find of the biblical material in the Quran. Now one final point, which sort of brings us back to something in the beginning, which was the pre-Islamic Basmala article of Ahmed al-Jalad, which is to say that the more that we are discovering about 6th and early 7th century Arabia from the inscriptions, is that indeed monotheism was widespread. And to my knowledge, although I'm happy to be corrected, all of our 6th century Arabic inscriptions are monotheistic. So the century before the origins of Islam, all of the Arabic inscriptions we found are monotheistic. Some, and we'll see an example of this, are explicitly Christian. Others simply refer to El-Ilah, is how the way it's usually put. Others in South Arabian refer to Rahmanan or Ar-Rahman, but they are all monotheistic. There are, of course, plenty of pagan inscriptions in Arabia. Alad and is one of the most popular figures in Arabic inscriptions, but they disappear from the record of inscriptions, both in South Arabia and in North Arabia in the 6th century. So monotheism was stirring in Arabia, and it's not a surprise to find biblical elements in the Qur'an. So I want to give just one last example by way of conclusion of a mixed Arabic and Aramaic text. In this case, the research is done not by Ahmed Al-Jalad, but Leila Name, who herself works on archaeological expeditions in the northern part of Saudi Arabia. This is an inscription that was found near Duma, north of Medina, and basically the inscription, which has certain Aramaic elements, like here, that's the word bar, which you can see in Arabic script. So this is very late Nabatean or early Arabic script. The language is principally Arabic. You could see here very clearly Al-Ilah. This is probably dhikr, meaning may he be remembered, may God remember. Dhikr al-Ilah. The full inscription says, may God remember, and the name is very unclear. It's a problem actually because that root is not known in the onomastica or the list of names in pre-Islamic Arabia, son of Salama. And then this is probably also the Aramaic word for a month. And then we have a set of letters representing years, which add up to 443 in the Roman calendar of Arabia, which is equivalent to about AD 550. And this, according to Leila Nahme, is a cross, meaning that the inscription was Christian. So I would say that much as the study of Judaism is important in New Testament studies, and that's a normal insight that's been embraced by the field of New Testament studies. If you come to my department at the University of Notre Dame to study New Testament, you will have to study the Hebrew language and what's known as Second Temple Judaism to understand the Jewish context of Christianity's origins. I would suggest that the study of Judaism, and especially Christianity, is important to Quranic studies. And then just as a final note, this is a picture. I could just turn the camera around and show it to you, I guess, but this is the picture of my bookshelf just above where I work here at Notre Dame in my office here. The Arabic books are on that side, but just above my workspace, the Quran and the Bible are living happily together. Okay, and with that, I will conclude. Thank you for your patience with me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gabriel. I think that was very interesting. I'm sure there will also be a lot of questions too on this, I'm sure. But before we move on to a small discussion between you and me, I think since Sheikh Arif may have to leave soon because he misunderstood that his class or lecture starts at 2 London time, but actually it starts at 3, so we will have to leave by 3. I would rather now ask Sheikh Arif Saab for a brief intervention here, and maybe he could give his thoughts, and maybe he can have a small conversation with you before he leaves. Sheikh Arif, over to you.
No, thank you so much for that wonderful talk and presentation. And you're quite right when Faiz Saab said in his introduction, and as you also mentioned, the Quran expects us to fill in the gaps through the reading of the former scriptures. And of course, when the Prophet faced the pluralistic community of Medina, the first few verses stated that we confirm our faith in the previous scriptures. And they were always meant to be read alongside each other. And especially when it comes to the Genesis and the human creation and existence, the Quran leaves the whole story extremely ambiguous, as if to expect us to fill in the gaps from our reading of former scriptures. some of the points that you mentioned are absolutely amazing. And I've always felt that the Pharaoh that adopted Moses was a different Pharaoh to the one that chased Moses out or was drowned. And you confirmed that from the biblical sources. The only thing I'm wondering here is that, was there a tradition of marrying within the families in order to preserve the royal lineage, like the Assyrians? Is it at all possible that the Pharaoh might have married his own daughter? And the other point is the interesting point you made about the dog, that the angel was then interpreted as a dog, and that the dog is frowned upon within the Islamic literature. Actually, we are finding now that that's not the case. Dogs were seen as friendly animals in the time of the Prophet, and this development of dogs being filthy within Islam is a later development, but it's yet to come out in the mainstream. Sorry, those were my observation and that brief question about Pharaoh. Did they have a similar tradition like the Assyrians in marrying in their own families?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sheikh Arif. And I'm honored that you're staying with us. Thank you for your patience with my talk and your response. My knowledge of ancient Egypt is really thin, so I probably shouldn't speculate on that. I mean, I would only add that to my knowledge, the word Pharaoh, as it's used in Hebrew and then in Greek, it means something like originally meant like the palace, but then became used for the ruler, a little bit like we might say the White House to represent the President of the United States. And usually in the biblical text, the Pharaoh is given as the Egyptian title, but without great details. And then people try to piece it together to try to find a historical context, which Pharaoh was in the time of Joseph, which Pharaoh was in the time of Moses. As you know, in the Quranic text, in Surah Yusuf, we have Melek and not Pharaoh. And in the Moses material, only Pharaoh. And so it's a bit of a speculative argument on my behalf that we have just one Pharaoh in Moses' childhood and adulthood. And even the way in that passage with Pharaoh's wife, it says Asa, like maybe we will adopt him. And so I would agree that there's open questions there, not resolved. And very important point about the dogs. I mean, I know that the fuqaha have very specific, and I'm not a specialist in fiqh, but have very specific ideas about, what is licit with the dog, touching a dog, being licked by a dog. So there are all sorts of minute legal discussions about what that can be. Can a dog be inside or outside? But I do know that in some of the dictionaries on animals, that precisely as you say, dogs are praised. And certainly in Surah Al-Kahf, there is no sign of any sort of sense of the impurity of the dog. Rather, it seems to be there as protection, because I think the word is basit. It's stretching out its paws over the entrance of the cave in a sort of protective manner. And so I would agree that there's a positive description of the dog. And even though I'm a cat person, I have cats and not dogs. I still am glad for that. So.
Thank you so much. I will take leave now. I'm going into another discussion right now.
Okay, best wishes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sheikh Arif, that was wonderful. That was a very interesting question that you raised. Perhaps we could further discuss it in one of your lectures to our forum once again. But now I think we should let you go.
Thank you so much. God bless you all.
Thank you for joining us, Sheikh
God bless
Arif,
you.
despite your busy schedule.
Thanks
a lot. And now to continue this discussion, Gabriel, that was fascinating, actually. But I have a small question. I mean, might even seem silly to you from your perspective. Are you there, Gabriel? I mean, I can't see you.
Of course, yes,
Yeah,
I'm there.
Yeah, thank you. you spoke about the Quran. Of course, the Quran does demand. The very fact that the Quran keeps mentioning about Torah, Injil, and the Zabur, and Quran, even like Sheikh Arif said, Quran said that musaddiqan lima bayna yadayhi. I mean, it actually confirms what you already have. The Quran says to the Christians and the Jews. But then the biblical scholarship itself, that was the Quranic period. That was the 7th century Arabia, and perhaps in those days the texts were there. But today, as we know, Christian scholars themselves question many of the biblical books, including the gospel themselves. And the gospels, as we know, were not just 4; there were many, and they were just canonized during the Constantine. I mean, in 620, I mean 325, in the Council of Nicaea, as you know. And also there is also the issue, for instance, just to give one example of the comma Johanneum, as they call it, right? The Johannine comma in the first epistle of John, wherein the text itself is, the many Christian scholars say that it is interpolated, especially the text that is in question here is, for there were 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Now, this itself is being considered a kind of a interpolated text, which has come from the first epistle of John in the New Testament. So, how would you link it in the context of the Quran, denying this Trinity, which is mentioned here in the Johannine comma? The Quran denies wala taqulu salasa, the Quran says. So although the Quran also uses the subtext of the Bible, it also, in a sense, that corrects it. Or perhaps is it? Do you think that the Quran is talking about this Johannine kind of Johannine comma, where this text is interpolated, and is trying to tell the Christians that that was not the original case with in your scripture. There was no Trinity. And how would you interpret it, Gabriel?
Great, wonderful questions, and I'm happy that we can speak a little bit about debates over the canon of the New Testament. I would say maybe 2 things, although I'm really not a specialist, and maybe it'd be of interest to have a New Testament scholar join at some point who could really speak in detail. But one point is, I alluded to this, but my understanding is that, in fact, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only texts in the form and shape of what we think of as a gospel. Yes. So when we think of the so-called Apocryphal Gospels, whether it be the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Judas, or the Gospel of the 12 Apostles, none of them are in the literary genre of gospel. They've just been given this name, gospel. So they don't, for example, what draws together even the Gospel of John, which is very distinctive in style, but what draws together the 4 Gospels is they're all accounts of the ministry of Christ, and they have a religious argument that through his life, death, and resurrection, the believer is saved. And most of the so-called Apocryphal Gospels are, in fact, most of them are sayings, collections of sayings, and some are just miracle accounts, but they don't follow that literary form. So in Islamic tradition, as you know, different authors make arguments about there were 80 Gospels or something like that. But what we find is a little bit different in the manuscript evidence. In terms of the canonization of the New Testament, it's true that the 27 books of the New Testament and official proclamations are quite late. My understanding is that they're even later than Constantine. It was not Constantine, but is probably in the later 4th century. But then keep in mind that the Christianity was basically a banned religion and persecuted until the time of Constantine. And so it was impossible to organize something like councils in which declarations would be made. But we do have, it seems pretty clear that by the late 2nd century, by the time of Irenaeus, for example, that Christians knew 4 Gospels. So Irenaeus, and then in the early 3rd century, Tertullian speak of 4 Gospels and the witness of that. So there are some books of the New Testament, especially the book of Revelation, which in certain Eastern churches took a while for it to enter into the canon. But the Gospels doesn't really seem to be controversial. Yeah, you're right about the Johannine comma in First John. Good biblical scholars would not see that as an ancient text. They would see that as an interpolation, definitely. And even Christian apologists who are responsible wouldn't cite that. They would cite other arguments for the Trinity in the New Testament, like the end of Matthew or the baptism scene or those sorts of things. But I also agree with you that whether or not the Quran has in mind a particular passage of the New Testament when saying in Surah Al-Ma'idah la taqul thalatha, or maybe at the end of Surah Al-Ma'idah, where God speaks to Jesus and says, "Anta qulta lin-nasi yattakhiduni wa ummiya ilahaini min dun Allah." In those sorts of passages, I do think that the Quran is conscious of the Christian teaching of the Trinity. Some people find this complicated by the possibility that there were different Christian heresies around. I think the Quran is simply conscious of the mainstream teaching of the Trinity and its focus on Allah as the only true God, which is evident throughout the text. It's concerned with shirk. Even when it speaks of Abraham, it adds that message, right? In various passages, including Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Imran, وَمَا كَانَ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ, right? So it claims, it says, Abraham came before the Torah and before the Injil. He was a Hanif, وَمَا كَانَ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. So clearly it is concerned with articulating a notion about the problem of shirk. There's another interesting insight. I don't want to go on too long, so I'll shut up in just a second. But Ahmed Jalad has written about an inscription which refers to Alat and a god known as One, Had. And he thinks that that's borrowing from Judaism, the reference to the true God as simply one, as Had or Ahad. And that inscription represents a form of Arabian shirk, so that certain Arabs maintained their belief in their ancient Arabian gods or goddesses while they borrowed the god of the Jews, and resulting in a sort of shirk. Anyway, who knows if he's right? It's hard to know because it's a single inscription. But I would agree the Quran is anti-Trinitarian. The Quran is conscious that the Christians make the claims that Father, Son, and Spirit are one God. It rejects those claims, and the passage in Surah Al-Ma'idah you quote is central to that.
Yes, I think you're right about it, because the Quran is anti-Trinitarian. But it is not anti-Christian, as many people would believe. This is also some kind of a fake news is being spread by people. The Quran is not anti-Christian. It may be anti-Trinitarian, or it just doesn't believe in the idea of any kind of an hypostatic union. That's it. But as you would agree with me, the Quran also uses the term muhaimin in the Quran, apart from musaddiq. At one point the Quran says the Quran also confirms and also protects. So the Quran is trying to protect the dogma or the doctrine, basic doctrine of other prophets, which the Quran makes it an article of faith for all Muslims to recognize and believe in. So I think in that sense, I'm sure you would also agree with me that the Quran is trying to protect the doctrine of the biblical scriptures. And I think that's why I feel that a lot of other scriptures which were deliberately kept out of the canon perhaps assume significance here. Would you agree with me on that, Gabriel?
To me, it's an open question whether the Quran is clear about. Now, of course, I'm speaking not as a Muslim believer, so just from an outside perspective, it's not clear to me if the Quran is in conversation with or aware of the canon of the Bible. It's a difficult question. I introduced briefly what the canon looks like in Christianity and Judaism. And we don't find, for example, references to Tanakh or Old Testament, New Testament. Biblical books are generally, maybe with the exception of Zabur, and we have a famous quotation in Surah Al-Anbiya, which refers, maybe cites the Zabur, would be the one case of a biblical book quoted by name. But other than that, biblical books, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, are not cited by name, either
Yes.
by their Jewish names or their Christian names in the
Yes.
Quran. We have instead the sorts of titles that Christians and Jews would use in a very general way. Jews speak of the Torah either to refer to the law or the Bible in a general way. Christians speak about the gospel, Injil, in the singular to refer to the message about Jesus. But when they speak about the scripture, they would speak about Anajil, the four gospels. So I would be a bit hesitant about that point. I don't know if the Quran is really interested in saying that these other books are also scripture or these books are not scripture, just because we have general categories and not specific references to specific biblical books. We also have the intriguing reference in Surah 5, which says something like, maybe I get my quotation wrong, but something like لِيَحْكُمُوا أَهْلُ الْإِنْجِيلِ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ.
Yes.
So let the people of the gospel judge according
By
to
what
what
has
God
been
has.
revealed to them. Yes.
Yeah, what has been revealed in it, right?
Yes.
Fihi, I'm
Yes.
reading that correctly,
Yes. You're right.
which would seem to affirm the gospel. So it's a complicated topic.
You're right about that. The Quran tells, I mean, when people come to the Prophet for judgment, the Quran says, when you have the gospel, why come to the Prophet for judgment? Why don't you judge in accordance with what has already been revealed to you? The Quran is kind of recognizing the gospel already here, the Injil. So that's an interesting thing which most Muslims do not accept, unfortunately. The Quran does not dismiss. There are ahadiths with the Muslims who say that once the Prophet actually got angry with Hazrat Umar when he saw him reading the Bible, or maybe the Torah, whatever it. But I think these kind of ahadiths or reports may not be authentic, because the Quran does not ask you to reject. It may be the Muhaymin and try to protect the doctrine, but it does not reject it, and it makes it an article of faith. Otherwise, the Quran making it an article of faith would make no difference, right? I mean, it would make no sense. So therefore, the Quran is very inclusive, as you said in the beginning itself. It was not an opposition, it's not the Quran was copying anything or trying to lift things from the other scriptures. It was trying to, as you said, build a conversation, trying to make it the subtext, to tell the world that, it's the same message, the same value system that was there. And then, of course, just one brief point, Gabriel, you mentioned about the people of the cave, in Surah Kahf. And there you mentioned about money. In the money, in the translation that you quoted, you spoke about paper money, if I recall. But of course, that's the word in Arabic too. The word is just be warakhihim, if I'm not correct wrong, be warakhikum hazihi, right?
Yes.
The word, the Arabic word there is be warakhikum hazihi. The word is warak. Warak actually means paper, but some translation of the Quran use the word silver coin. So can that be a translation, correct translation? The silver coin.
I think it is.
The word
I think it's certainly a coin. And my understanding is that, and I don't understand why exactly, but that in fact that root waraqa, although it's associated with leaves and then later with paper, of course, paper is not used in 7th century Arabia. Parchment is used, so paper is an impossibility. Probably paper is introduced much later. But my understanding and the context is that the only monetary system being used, or the only material being used for money is coins in the context. And so I think by that question, waraqa there has to mean coin.
Has to mean coin, but in your translation that you presented,
it's a bad translation. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think
but
I was wondering, there was no question
of
paper in those days.
Yeah, there was no paper in our early manuscripts, for example, are on parchment. Some early documents on papyrus, but nothing on paper.
That's true.